The SkyActiv engine was designed for more torque and more real-world fuel economy. Hey, I'm Jonathan Sewell Sales at Mitchell Mazda on the Boulevard in Enterprise. And behind me, I've got two 2020 Mazda 6s, one Grand Touring and one Touring. And we're gonna dive under the hood and look at the differences in the standard engines for those models. But before we do, go ahead and click the JSS down here at the bottom so that you can subscribe to my channel and find out all the good information about Mazda vehicles. Let's get going. All right, I apologize up front if it's a little bit noisy. We are close to the boulevard here, but these were sitting right next to each other and it was just too convenient. So what I'm looking at here is a 2020 Mazda 6 Touring. Of course, this is standard with the 2.5 liter SkyActiv-G inline four-cylinder, which is naturally aspirated. So just taking a step back here and looking, what you'll see is you have some airflow right up here into this air box, which is where your air filter will be. And then, of course, comes right in here to the engine. So this is where your fresh air is coming in for your intake. And if you will step around the back here, this is where, back here is where your exhaust would be coming out. And so this is directed into the system's exhaust all the way to the back there, out the tailpipe. And a couple of things to mention about this engine is it has an extremely high compression ratio. And that's one thing when it first came out for, when they first came out with this engine, of course, in conjunction with the turbo that we'll look at in just a minute, the purpose was to have a high compression rate, which would lead to better fuel economy. The problem traditionally with a high compression rate is that you have a loss of torque. And the SkyActiv-G was really designed, or the SkyActiv system was really designed to get better real-world fuel economy and better torque. They weren't as worried with horsepower, but more focused on torque, which is immediate off-the-line performance. So most of your normal aspiration engines are a compression ratio anywhere from 8-to-1 to 12-to-1. Well, this engine is actually 14-to-1. So one of the problems that you have with that is because of that high dynamic compression ratio, you have early combustion because it's so compressed with the mixture of fuel and air that it actually compresses or combusts before you want it to, and because everything's running so hot or so thermal. So a couple of things that are done for this really involve the rear of the engine here and the exhaust. But what they adopted with this engine is a long exhaust and a 4-2-1 system. So basically the first and the fourth cylinder have a longer exhaust point, and the two middle cylinders have one that's joined together. So what they're able to do is, as you're firing 1, 2, 3, 4, the exhaust gas from the first cylinder is able to come back and mix into the fourth, and vice versa, to help relieve some of that thermal issues. So again, visually looking, you can see how this design here actually does have sizing available for the extra hardware of the turbo, and but everything's coming at the bottom of the engine there out into the tailpipe. And so this SkyActiv-G 2.5 liter here, of course, has 187 horsepower, and 186 foot-pounds of torque. And so you can see in a lot, of course, this is the main engine that we use now across the line. And so traditionally, you do not see such high torque values at low RPMs. And that 186 foot-pounds of torque is at 2,000 RPMs because most drivers' behavior that Mazda, when they were developing this engine, and this helps get real-world fuel economy, most drivers typically spend a large percentage of their driving at 3,000 RPMs or below. It's very rare for someone to be higher up there or in that higher rev spectrum, especially with a 6-speed transmission, which is what's paired with these engines. But the SkyActiv engine was designed for more torque at a higher compression ratio, which is usually inversely related. So the higher compression ratio, the lower the torque, but they wanted higher torque and more real-world fuel economy. So what do I mean by real-world fuel economy? Mazda wants the real world, the actual driver's fuel economy, to match as close as possible to what the window sticker says, or perhaps even a little bit better. So a lot of times it's hard because the EPA testing is in a controlled environment, and because they use that for every manufacturer and every class of vehicle. However, we as drivers don't drive the exact same. So give me just a minute. We'll step over here to the 2.5 turbo on the Grand Touring Mazda 6. All right, so standard on the Grand Touring and above since 2018. So the Grand Touring Reserve, and the Signature have the SkyActiv-G 2.5T, so the turbo. So as we stand back and just look visually for a minute, the immediate difference that we see is that when this air comes into the air box with the air filter here, it's rerouted all the way to the back here with the turbo system there. So it's actually going back almost around the engine to where the turbo is located in the back. Also, visually, you see these grooves right here. It's a little bit wider of a noise shield here. So that's the first thing you notice in the different engine, and how the SkyActiv-G is badged here differently instead of just, it's embossed instead of just the pop-out font there. Back here in the back where all the exhaust is and the turbo, you see there's a lot more going on. And if we remember, the space that was open on the previous engine is now full of this hardware. So a couple of things that to pick up where we talked about before. This one, of course, with 87 octane gets 227 horsepower. And if you go to 93 octane or premium fuel, it'll jump to 250. So you see over 60 horsepower increase. However, the torque is 310 foot-pounds of torque. So again, we see that jump from 186 to 310, and that's what the SkyActiv engines are all about, is getting more torque. So how this works, or let's just step back to a normal conversation about a turbo engine. Usually when you accelerate in lower RPMs, there's what's known as a turbo lag. What that means is that this engine is pretty much acting on its own without that charge from the turbo. And so what these developers or engineers have created is through the exhaust gas, and that's why this turbo is located in the rear there. Through the exhaust gas, they can actually charge the turbo through smaller channels of exhaust gas coming back into it, and then at lower RPMs, shooting a higher pressure of exhaust gas to charge the turbo and get it to spin. So how the engineers describe this is like when you have a water hose and you put your thumb over it. it's not the exact it's not the same volume of water coming out of the water hose. However, the pressure is increased, and that's what they're doing back here in the back at low RPMs. Again, going back to the previous statement, most drivers drive below 3,000 RPM. So to get the most torque out of this setup, this engine with the turbo, they have to find a way to get, with a strong compression, they have to find a way to get that turbo acting more frequently without a lag. So they do that with the exhaust gas. Now also, the same type of setup here with the outside cylinders, the same kind of setup here for the exhaust manifold. So as it comes out into it, it's the long, and it's a 4-3-1 setup. So your middle two cylinders do kind of group together, and it allows some of that extra setup in the cylinders, so it prevents the premature combustion, same as the other engine. And this one actually has the upgraded EGR module to help in that recirculation. Excuse me. To help in that recirculation, to make sure that you do not have a loss in torque at this higher compression ratio. So again, looking at these two, and one thing that you'll notice, other than the window sticker, there is no extra badging that shows the turbo engine. So you'd only be able to, in the case of used purposes, if you don't know, you can pop the hood and look at this design and see where the air is moving, and of course see the turbo back there visually is the only way that you can tell when looking at a vehicle. So talking about real world fuel economy, right here on the window sticker, 23 and 31 with 26 combined, they're actually able to do a little bit more in real world testing, and this is from a third party source, not from Mazda or the EPA. And that's what Mazda is trying to achieve, is better EPA rating or better performance than the EPA rating. Now, as I mentioned, we'll walk around in the back here, and this is the Grand Touring. This is the Grand Touring, and of course we have the updated Mazda logo, or the Mazda font, but you see SkyActiv-G, and then the Touring over here, Mazda6 SkyActiv-G. So you will not be able to tell just from visual look on these two vehicles which one has the turbo unless you pop the hood and take a peek there. So thanks for joining me for this video under the hood of the Mazda 6, comparing this SkyActiv-G engine 2.5T and the normal aspirated 2.5, and I will put up a split screen there just so you can be reminded of the differences just looking at the two. And again, as we look at that comparison, you can see the visual differences, and I hope that I wasn't too confusing or over technical, because I'm not a mechanic, a technician, certified technician, or a engineer, so a lot of this is still a little bit hard to figure in my mind, but again, thank you for joining me with this look. If you have any questions or comments or anything that I overlooked, or anything else that maybe I misspoke about, please drop that in the comments below. And if you have any immediate questions, you can always call or text me at 334-718-0504. Again, just showing you a little bit of the differences here as we walk around. I'm Jonathan Sewell Sales at Mitchell Mazda on the Boulevard in Enterprise. And I really hope that at one point you will be driving one of your very own, a great Mazda.